What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Kelsey's Constrictors. In today's video, I'm going to cover how big ball pythons actually get and what you should be feeding them. I want to cover this topic because I've seen quite a few funny postings online, either on Craigslist or some other selling platform, where people are selling Burmese pythons, reticulated pythons, boas, and all sorts of other kinds of snakes. And you open up the ad, and what is it a picture of? A ball python. I find it hilarious. I always try to send people a message to correct them in case someone else would be interested in buying a ball python, not a boa, not a Burmese python, not a reticulated python, ball python. It really blows my mind how some people have no knowledge whatsoever and don't make any effort to obtain any knowledge whatsoever about the animal that they are acquiring. Like, really? Ball python, Burmese python? You're talking about a 4-foot snake versus a 14-foot snake? How do you not know that that's what you're getting? So that's one reason that I want to make this video, just to make sure the air is clear and everyone knows what they need to know before they get a snake. So before I get into what you should be feeding your snake, I want to talk about the different sizes of ball pythons. So these are all of my own determinations as far as weights go for what I call each size snake. It might be different for everybody, or there may be a set weight limit for each name of each size. I really don't know. This is just kind of what I go by. So for hatchlings, I say hatchlings are 50 grams up to 100 grams. A juvenile ball python would be 100 grams up to 500 grams. A sub-adult ball python would be 500 to 1200 to 1500, depending on the snake and the gender. And then an adult ball python is anything over 1200 or 1500 grams. Ball pythons are typically fully grown or mostly fully grown by the time they're 3 years old. Male ball pythons are smaller than females, so if you're looking for a smaller snake in the ball python family, go for a male. Most males don't get over 2000-ish grams. Most females don't get over 2500-ish grams. There are some female ball pythons out there that are pushing 4, maybe even 5000 grams, but those are definitely an anomaly and not your average snake. One of the reasons why weighing your snakes and keeping track of their weight is so important is because that's one of the most crucial things you can do to make sure your snake is healthy. Snakes are very good at hiding if they're sick, so they may even still be eating if they're not at the top of their game or if they have some kind of issue. But weighing your snake is going to be one of the best ways that you can tell if they are actually healthy or not, because if they're eating and they're pooping and everything looks fine but they're losing weight, then you have a problem. If they're not eating and they're still losing weight, then you could have a problem. If they're not eating and their weight is maintaining, you should be okay. Just keep an eye on it. But weighing your snake is going to be a great way for you to tell what's going on with the health of the animal if there are no other signs. Females should wait until they're 1500 grams, so that's kind of why the adult sub-adult thing gets a little confusing as far as weights goes. But like I said before, most ball pythons are either fully grown or almost fully grown by the time they are 3 years old. So if you remember the purple chart that I talked about in the last video I did, I want to cover that in more detail today. You can feed ball pythons mice, rats, or African soft fur rats. Mice are not ideal only because it makes them grow a lot smaller, and rats have a higher fat content, which is why it's better for them, and that's why they put on more weight and they grow faster if you feed rats versus mice. So in this chart that I have attached here, you can see the different ages of the ball python based on what they're eating and their weight that coincides with what they're eating. For a 1-month-old ball python, you can see that eating mice, that puts them at 78 grams, and eating rats puts them at 99 grams within 1 month. And as you continue down the chart, you can see that the growth compounds over time. So it looks like it's not a lot of growth in the beginning because they're so small, but as they continue to eat rats versus mice, you can see that their growth compounds quite a bit. So after 4 months, there's a 77 gram difference between the snakes. Their age-weight correlation does depend on what they're being fed. If you're getting into breeding or thinking about getting into breeding, this is definitely something to consider because female ball pythons will be ready to breed about 3 years old, 1500 grams, but if you have a mouser, it's going to take her much longer to be ready to breed, maybe 4 or 5 years before she's up to weight if she's eating mice instead of rats. Just keep in mind that anything I say about breeding with ball pythons is based on a rat diet. So now that I've touched on the weight of the snakes, I want to talk about the length of the snakes because some people only care about how long the snake is. Ball pythons typically are 4 to 6 feet. 6 feet is on the very large side. That would be like a large female. Most ball pythons end up being 4 to 5 feet. This is Xena. She is probably 1 to 2 years old, and I would guess she's about 3 feet. It's very hard to measure snakes if you can't tell because they never stay still. But I would guess she's about 3 feet. Again, she's a subadult, 1 to 2 years old. She's still got another year to go before I can breed her, at least. She's about 900 grams. But yeah, ball pythons, female ball pythons are on the larger end, males are on the smaller end. They might even be 3.5 to 5-ish feet for males, and then 4 to 6 feet for females. So they don't get very, very big. They're definitely handleable even once they're an adult. So if you're looking for a good sized snake that is not going to intimidate you every time you open the bin and you're afraid it's going to kill you, but it also has considerable size to it, a ball python might be a good option for you. So in my last video, I did go into much more detail about the different rodent sizes, their names, and what you should be feeding to your snake. If you would like to go check that out, I will link it above. So I'm not going to go into great detail about that here, but I do want to talk about some pros and cons about what you're feeding your snake. So aside from the rats versus mice, which I already covered, there's also the choice between live and frozen. And live and frozen both have their pros and cons, and I'll go over some of them so you can help decide what's best for you. Before I was keeping snakes on a large scale like I am now, I was feeding all frozen to my snakes. I didn't want to feed live, I didn't want to see something die, I didn't want to hear something die, so I always fed everything frozen. Well, now that I have a large collection of snakes, some of my snakes refuse to eat frozen, so I had to start doing live. Well, then I figured I'm spending all this money on rats for these 15 snakes, so I might as well just start breeding rats. If you haven't seen my rat breeding video, I will link that right here as well. Since I started breeding rats, I realized that live is actually a lot easier and better for me personally, especially with the situation I'm in where my snakes are not in my house right now, they're at my friend's house, so I don't have them with me every day, I can't check on them every day, but when I do go over there, usually once or twice a week, I check on everybody and I feed as need be. The great thing about feeding live is if somebody doesn't eat, I can just put it right back. Nothing goes to waste. That's a great perk for me because I really hate wasting money. And the other pro to feeding live is I don't have to hold a dead rat on the end of my tongs going like this, shaking, trying to make it look alive, and then having to reheat it and put it back in there and doing this for 10 minutes, and my arm's getting all tired because they're deciding not to eat. I don't have to do any of that with feeding live. Another perk of feeding live rats is you can start your own breeding colony. One of the cons of live rats is the smell, whether you're keeping them for breeding or not. If you don't keep any as kind of like a backstock for your snakes, then you're going to the store every single week and you're buying exactly what you need. It gets very expensive for one, and number two, very time consuming because you're going to the store every single week. The other thing to think about if you're feeding live is you have to supervise your snake with the rat that's in there, especially if it's a bigger rat. Sometimes the rat can hurt the snake if it's scared of it, or if the snake tries to strike at it, even if it's a defensive strike and then the rat gets scared, the rat can hurt your snake. Sometimes I've had this happen with one of mine. Sometimes when they wrap them up as they're suffocating them, the rat's teeth can actually sink into the snake's skin and it can cause their scales to come off, it can cause a bacterial infection, it can cause all kind of little problems, and then they might even have a little scar stuck on them, which isn't the end of the world, but you don't want the rat to hurt your snake. So that's another con to feeding live, is you have to supervise every single feeding that you do. The other thing to think about if you're feeding live, whether you're keeping a back stock for your snakes or you're getting into breeding or you're just going to the store every week and buying them, is you always have to have the right sizes on hand. So that's important because if you're only going to the store and buying them once a week, there's quite a few times that I've been there and tried to buy mice or tried to buy certain size rats and they just don't have them because of the way their breeding schedules worked out or whatever. They just didn't have any of that size at that time, or maybe they sold them all. So that's another thing to keep in mind if you're planning on feeding live. The store might not have the sizes you need, and you also, if you're planning on breeding or keeping them yourself, you also need to make sure you're staggering your breeding so that you always have the correct sizes of what you need. The great thing about feeding frozen is I don't have to hear the poor little thing die. I can leave it in there overnight if I need to, because some of my snakes, for a while there, I had a couple of them that didn't want to be watched while they ate or something like that, so I would leave it in there overnight and they would eat it overnight. The other great thing about frozen is there's no time limit on when you get to feed it to your snake. It stays in the freezer, it's not alive, it stays the same size, so anytime you want to feed it, you can feed it and it's going to work out for your snake. So you could buy 60 medium frozen rats and they could be in your freezer for 6 months or a year. I think the shelf life for frozen rodents is 6 months, but I'm basically saying you can keep them in there indefinitely and you can still feed them to your snake because they never change size. So that's another pro to feeding frozen to your snakes. The bad thing about feeding frozen is it can be very wasteful, and you have to learn how to feed your snakes on a staggered schedule. 2 snakes this day, 3 snakes this day, 4 snakes this day, and kind of try to organize it where you end up with picky eaters on one day and then you end up with garbage disposals on another day, so that way they don't go to waste. If these 2 don't eat, then you have 2 that always eat on the next couple of days that you can feed it to so it doesn't go to waste. For me, especially because my snakes, again, aren't in my house anymore, I can't check on them every day, so it's just easier for me to do live, because if I'm doing frozen, I can't do the staggered thing. I still have some frozen rodents that I will feed every now and then, but it's just, I just find it wasteful at this point now, because if I try to put a live rodent in there and they don't eat, I can just put it right back in the bin. So those are the main pros and cons of feeding live versus frozen. And I also just wanted to touch up on the different sizes of ball pythons and how big they actually get. And that is all I have for today's video. If you love snakes, hit the subscribe button. I come out with new videos every single week. Throw a comment down below if you have anything specific that you'd like to see. I do take requests for videos. So if there's anything you've been researching that you're finding conflicting information about, or you can't find anything about it, throw it in the comments below. I'll try to make a video on it. Make sure you follow us on Instagram. It's Kelsey's Constrictors, and I'll see y'all next time.